The year is 1970, and at this point Hammer Film Productions has released pictures such as The Horror of Frankenstein, The Vampire Lovers, and Scars of Dracula. Tune in next week. But the movie of choice is Taste the Blood of Dracula, directed by Peter Sasdy. The opening of this film takes place in between the events of the ending of the last film, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. Whilst wandering through the woods after being thrown out of a carriage, a businessman named Weller hears agonising yells from nearby. He attempts to run away but trips and falls. When looking up in complete horror, he sees Dracula impaled on the golden crucifix. After Dracula has disintegrated, Weller goes down the hill and examines what is left of the Count. This would imply that Weller was nearby when Dracula was dying at the end of the previous movie. If this was the case, why didn't the priest, Paul, and Maria warn Weller not to go near Dracula's remains, as they were present? I realise I'm thinking too deep into this, but it has always bugged me. Later on in the film, we're introduced to three characters named Hargud, played by Geoffrey Keane, Paxton, played by Peter Sallis, and Secker, played by John Carson, who was featured in another Hammer classic, The Plague of the Zombies. These gentlemen as a group visit a brothel, and it's there that they encounter a man named Lord Courtly, played by Ralph Bates, who played Baron Frankenstein in The Horror of Frankenstein. Courtly was disinherited by his father for celebrating Black Mass years ago. Courtly entices the three gentlemen by asking them if they would be willing to sell their soul to the devil, and he promises them it would be an experience they would never forget. Courtly is a central figure in the plot of resurrecting Dracula. His character is crucial to the storyline, and he becomes a vessel for Dracula's return. Courtly takes the three gentlemen to visit Weller, who still has Dracula's belongings. The gentlemen purchase them, and they later meet up with Courtly in an abandoned church to begin the resurrection of Count Dracula. Courtly begins the ritual by giving the gentlemen goblets and putting Dracula's dried blood into each goblet. He then cuts his hand and mixes his own blood with Dracula's. Courtly then tells the gentlemen to drink from the goblets, but they refuse, and this causes Courtly to drink the blood himself. However, after consuming the blood, he screams, falls to his knees, and begs for help from the gentlemen. They then beat Courtly to death. The gentlemen part, and as time passes, Courtly's body transforms into Count Dracula. From here, Dracula will seek revenge on the three gentlemen who killed his servant. This would mark Christopher Lee's fourth time playing Dracula for Hammer. This isn't at all my favourite portrayal of the character. He was much better in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and it's nothing to do with Christopher Lee. I've always admired him as an actor. My issue is with the writing and the story itself. Lee just seems like another side character in this movie, and although he didn't have a lot of dialogue in the previous Dracula movies, he still held a commanding presence. Here, it seems that Dracula was the last thing to be written into the script, which is how Christopher Lee felt about the character after Dracula Prince of Darkness. Originally, the film wasn't going to feature Christopher Lee as Dracula at all. Instead, the film was going to feature Ralph Bates as Courtly as the main character, due to Christopher Lee's increasing reluctance to reprise his role. The alternative plot would include Courtly coming back from the dead as a vampire and seeking revenge on the three gentlemen who killed him. Personally, I think that sounds so much better than what we actually got. Hammer's American distributor refused to release the film if it lacked an appearance by Dracula. This prompted Hammer to convince Lee to return, with Dracula replacing the resurrected Courtly, even though Christopher Lee didn't care to play the character anymore.
I got another script, and I read it, and I said, I'm not going to do this. He said, why not? I said, it's terrible. I mean, the dialogue is not good, the character isn't Stoker's character at all. I'm just standing there in a corner and occasionally doing something, for someone, but not much more. I said, I don't want to do it. And my agent was absolutely horrified. This happened with the third film and the fourth film and the fifth film. I turned them all down. Said no.
The characters in this film don't really stand out as much as they did in previous entries in the Hammer Dracula series, especially when compared to the previous movie. The main love interest in this film is a young woman named Alice, played by Linda Hayden, whose father happens to be Hargud. He doesn't like the fact that she continuously is seeing Paul. Not you, Barry Andrews. This time round, Paul is played by Anthony Corlan. One night, Alice's father comes home drunk and threatens to beat her. Out of the three gentlemen, I think Hargood, in my opinion, is the one who deserved his fate more than any of them.
The first.
There's also a character named Lucy, who has nothing to do with Lucy Westenra from Stoker's original novel. This Lucy goes by the name Lucy Paxton and is the daughter of Paxton and also the sister of Paul. Unlike Xena from Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, I don't find Lucy to be a very interesting character. With Xena, there was a love triangle between her, Paul, and Maria, so some thought had been given to the character. Here, in this film, Lucy is just a victim for Dracula. The only standout scene for me is when Alice and Lucy are under Dracula's control and Lucy kills her own father.
The second.
Secker meets his end when he is stabbed by his own son Jeremy. This is after Jeremy is bitten by Lucy, who is his fiancée, and under her control.
The third.
Secker is the last out of the three gentlemen and seems to know more about vampires and how to destroy them. He writes a letter to Paul about how to destroy the vampires. Now, I don't really care for Alice and Paul in this film. I thought that Paul and Maria were handled so much better in the previous film, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. I love the relationship between the two characters. Paul in that film is an atheist and Maria has grown up in a religious household. So when invited to dinner, Paul confesses to her uncle that he's an atheist, and this causes tension between the two characters. I don't think that Paul and Alice in Taste the Blood of Dracula are well-written characters, especially when compared to the previous film. James Bernard once again returns to do the score, and he still manages to deliver. Although not one of the standout scores in the Hammer Dracula series, it's still worth mentioning. Moving on to the Count's death now, Paul goes to the abandoned church where the resurrection of Dracula took place. He bars the door with a cross and clears the altar of Lord Courtly's black cloth and candles and replaces them with a white cloth and candles. He lights the candles and calls for Alice, who is still under Dracula's control. The Count soon awakens and is confronted by Paul, who holds a cross in front of him. Dracula then instructs Alice to take it away. Paul tells Alice that she's free to choose good or evil, and she still chooses to be with Dracula. She eventually takes away the cross and Dracula throws Paul up against the wall and dismisses Alice. She then throws the cross in front of Dracula, which stops him from leaving. Now Alice is free of Dracula's control. Soon, Dracula is on the balcony of the church throwing objects at Paul and Alice below. He backs up into a stained glass window that has a crucifix. When he turns and smashes the window, he sees that the church is holy again and hears the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Dracula screams and falls down on the altar, where he disintegrates into dust once more. This death still makes no sense to me. It has to be the laziest death that Hammer has ever given Dracula. I understand the whole thing between good and evil, that's a staple in every Dracula movie, especially with the Hammer Christopher Lee series, but overall the Count's death is like the film itself, badly written and lackluster. Overall, Taste the Blood of Dracula isn't the greatest in the Hammer Dracula series in my opinion. Next worst to this would be the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which I will get to in time. Compared to the previous movie, it's not memorable and doesn't do much with the Dracula character. In fact, I feel he had much more to do in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. The only interesting character, in my opinion, is Lord Courtly, who actually served a major purpose in the film. The only thing I can say that's actually decent about this movie is the writing in the opening sequence and how it keeps continuity with the previous film. Other than that, for me, it's the first disappointing entry in the franchise.
I have no further use for you.